In February 1942, a Soviet intelligence officer named Viktor Sokolov filed a classified report that would remain buried in Moscow's archives for 43 years. The document described something the Red Army Command refused to acknowledge: a Japanese woman operating alone in the forests between Manchuria and Siberia, who had eliminated 17 Soviet reconnaissance soldiers in less than 3 weeks. Her name was never confirmed. Her existence was officially denied. But the bodies she left behind told a story that no amount of silence could erase. The war along the Soviet-Japanese border had been cold, tense, and sporadic since the battles of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. By 1942, both nations maintained an uneasy non-aggression pact, but the forest zones remained contested, grey areas where patrols vanished, where intelligence officers crossed invisible lines, and where deaths were attributed to weather, accidents, or simply erased from records. It was in this nameless terrain that she operated, a figure so improbable that even those who witnessed her work struggled to reconcile what they had seen with what they believed possible. The first victim was Senior Lieutenant Andrei Volkov, a decorated officer responsible for monitoring Japanese troop movements near the Amur River. He was found on March 3, 1942, slumped against a birch tree, a single bullet wound through his left temple. The shot had come from an estimated distance of 400 meters, fired during a snowstorm that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. The precision was extraordinary. The weapon was identified through forensic analysis as a Type 97 sniper rifle, Japanese issue, modified for extended range. What disturbed Sokolov's team more than the kill itself was the placement. Volkov had been moving, and the shooter had accounted for wind, snow refraction, and the target's irregular gait. It was the work of someone who understood not just marksmanship, but physics, patience, and the rhythm of human movement under stress. 3 days later, 2 more soldiers disappeared during a patrol near Lake Kanka. Their bodies were recovered a week later, both killed by headshots from different angles, suggesting the shooter had relocated between kills without leaving tracks. The snow around the bodies was undisturbed, except for the patrol's own footprints. It was as if the shots had come from the air, or from someone who moved without weight, without presence. The battalion commander, Colonel Dmitry Orlov, initially dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Snipers were common. Skilled snipers were rare, but not impossible. A Japanese sniper operating this deep into Soviet-monitored territory was unlikely but conceivable. But a woman? The idea seemed absurd, a rumor born from fear and the disorienting fog of winter warfare. Then came the incident at Outpost 7. On March 18, 1942, an 8-man reconnaissance unit was stationed at a wooden observation post overlooking a frozen river valley. The post was considered secure, positioned on elevated ground with clear sightlines in all directions. At dawn, the unit's radio operator, Sergeant Mikhail Petrov, was shot through the observation slit while transmitting his morning report. The bullet entered at a downward angle, suggesting the shooter was positioned higher than the post itself, an impossibility given the terrain. Over the next 6 hours, 3 more soldiers were killed as they attempted to evacuate. Each shot was precise, each kill instant. The survivors, 2 men who managed to escape under cover of smoke grenades, reported seeing nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement. Just the sound of their comrades dying one by one, in a silence so complete it felt like the forest itself was hunting them. When recovery teams reached the outpost 2 days later, they found something that would haunt Sokolov for the rest of his life. A single strand of black hair caught on a branch 900 meters upslope from the post, and a depression in the snow where someone had lain prone for hours. The body heat had melted a shallow indent, and the angle matched the trajectory of the kills. Forensic analysts noted the size of the indent, too small for a standard male soldier. The hair was long, well-maintained, inconsistent with military grooming standards, and beside the firing position, pressed into the frost, was a single boot print, women's size, Japanese military issue, modified with additional insulation. Colonel Orloff buried the report. He ordered the survivors to silence. He reclassified the deaths as accidental engagement with unidentified partisan forces. But Viktor Sokolov kept his own records, and he began to track a pattern that the official narrative refused to see. Between February and May of 1942, 23 Soviet personnel were killed in the border forests under identical circumstances. Long-range precision kills, no witnesses, no traces, except for occasional evidence of a solitary shooter who moved like smoke and struck like iron. The kills occurred in temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius, in blizzards at night, and always in locations that should have been inaccessible to enemy snipers. Sokolov's final entry, dated May 9, 1942, read, "We are not hunting a soldier. We are being hunted by a ghost who understands this war better than we do. Command refuses to acknowledge her existence because to do so would mean admitting we have no defense against her. The men call her Yuki, the snow. They believe she is not human. I believe she is the most human thing about this war, alone, invisible, and unforgiving." The file was sealed in 1943, reclassified in 1967, and partially declassified in 1985. By then, the woman who may have been Yuki had been dead for decades, her identity still unknown, her story still unconfirmed. But in the margins of Sokolov's report, written in faded ink, was a question that no historian has yet answered. If she was never there, why did 23 men die the same way? The snow remembers what the archives will not. Her name, according to a single declassified document from Japanese military intelligence dated August 1940, was Akane Fujimoto. The file was 3 pages long, stamped with a classification level that restricted access to fewer than 12 officers, and it contained a photograph so faded that her features were barely distinguishable. Just the outline of a young woman in civilian clothing, standing beside a rifle range, her expression unreadable. The document identified her as the daughter of a low-ranking Imperial Army lieutenant stationed in Hokkaido, a girl who had grown up in the snowfields of Japan's northernmost island, learning to shoot not for war, but for survival. By the time she was 16, she could track deer through whiteout conditions and kill cleanly at distances that made professional hunters uncomfortable. By 18, she had outscored every marksman in her father's regiment during an informal shooting competition, an achievement that should have been celebrated but was instead quietly suppressed. Women did not serve in combat roles. Women did not hold rifles except in propaganda posters. And women certainly did not humiliate career soldiers in front of their peers. What happened next remains fragmentary, stitched together from intercepted Soviet intelligence, post-war interviews with surviving Japanese officers, and a single memoir written in 1968 by a former Kempeitai agent named Hiroshi Tanaka, who claimed to have been part of an experimental program that officially never existed. According to Tanaka, Akane Fujimoto was recruited in late 1940 by a secretive unit within the Kwantung Army's Intelligence Division, a program designed to train operatives for deep reconnaissance and sabotage in the event of renewed conflict with the Soviet Union. The program was small, desperate, and willing to overlook traditional gender restrictions in favor of results. Akane was chosen not despite being a woman, but because of it. She could move through contested zones without attracting the same level of scrutiny as male soldiers. She understood cold-weather survival instinctively, and her psychological profile suggested an unusual tolerance for isolation and moral ambiguity. The training was brutal. Conducted in the mountains of northern Manchuria, the program subjected recruits to conditions that broke most candidates within weeks. Akane endured. She learned to move without sound across frozen ground, to control her breathing in temperatures that froze, exhaled moisture into ice crystals, to calculate windage and bullet drop in blizzards that disoriented compasses and rendered maps useless. She was taught battlefield medicine, Soviet military structure, radio interception, and the art of psychological warfare. How to create fear, not through volume, but through precision. How to make an enemy doubt his own safety in his own territory. Most critically, she was trained to operate alone, without support, without extraction, and without the expectation of survival. The instructors called it shadow doctrine, the idea that a single operative, properly trained and psychologically conditioned, could destabilize an entire region through selective elimination of key personnel. By mid-1941, Akane Fujimoto had become something the Japanese military had never intended to create, a weapon they could not fully control, trained for a war they hoped would never come, and psychologically prepared for a mission that had no defined end. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the strategic calculus shifted. Japan's high command debated whether to open a second front in Siberia, but the decision was never formalized. Instead, assets like Akane were placed on indefinite standby, trained, armed, and waiting in the border regions, neither officially deployed nor officially withdrawn. It was in this liminal state, somewhere between soldier and ghost, that she began operating independently along the Soviet-Manchurian frontier. Soviet intelligence first became aware of her in February 1942, but Japanese records suggest she had been active since at least November 1941, conducting reconnaissance and limited sabotage operations that were too small to trigger official investigations. A destroyed radio relay here, a missing patrol there, minor incidents that could be attributed to weather, equipment failure, or local resistance. But by early 1942, her mission profile had changed. Whether acting on orders, personal initiative, or simple survival instinct, she had transitioned from reconnaissance to active elimination, targeting Soviet intelligence officers and scouts with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of their patrol routes, communication schedules, and psychological vulnerabilities. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. What made her so effective was not just her technical skill, but her understanding of the psychological dimension of fear. She never killed indiscriminately. She targeted officers, radio operators, scouts, individuals whose deaths would create maximum operational disruption and minimum public exposure. She varied her methods just enough to prevent pattern recognition, but maintained a signature precision that made her kills unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. And she moved constantly, never sleeping in the same location twice, never leaving traces that could be used to predict her next position. To the Soviet soldiers who hunted her, she was not a person, but a phenomenon, something that existed in the space between confirmed and impossible. The Japanese, for their part, maintained absolute silence. When Soviet diplomats inquired about reports of Japanese snipers operating in the border zones, Tokyo's response was unequivocal denial. No such operations were authorized. No such personnel existed. The woman described in Soviet intelligence reports was dismissed as propaganda, a useful fiction designed to justify Soviet military failures in remote territories. But within the Kwantung Army's classified archives, a different picture emerged. Commendations filed under false names, supply requisitions for specialized ammunition routed through unmarked channels, and a single notation in a logistics report from March 1942 that referenced Asset Yuki and included coordinates for a supply drop in the forests west of Lake Kanka. By April 1942, Akane Fujimoto, if that was still her name, if she still thought of herself as having a name, had become a problem for both sides. The Soviets could not catch her, the Japanese could not recall her, and the soldiers caught between them could only whisper her legend in the dark, hoping that precision and fear would bypass them, that the snow would claim someone else tonight. The file on Akane Fujimoto was sealed in 1943, destroyed in 1945 during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, and reconstructed decades later from fragments found in half-burned archives. The photograph survived, the girl in it, standing beside a rifle range in Hokkaido, smiling faintly at something outside the frame, did not. The war forgets its soldiers, but the snow remembers the girl who refused to die quietly. On April 7, 1942, Major Grigory Volkov of the NKVD border troops received orders that made him physically ill. He was to assemble a specialized hunter-killer team, enter the contested forest zone west of Lake Kanka, and eliminate or capture the sniper referred to in classified reports as Yuki. The mission was designated Priority Black, a classification reserved for threats to national security that could not be publicly acknowledged. Volkov had spent 18 years in military service, including 3 years hunting German snipers during the Finnish Winter War. He understood cold, isolation, and the psychology of predators who use distance as their primary weapon. But this assignment felt different. The briefing materials were incomplete, contradictory, and saturated with a tone he recognized from his years in the NKVD. Institutional fear disguised as operational urgency. The team consisted of 12 men, hand-picked for their experience in counter-sniper operations and wilderness survival. Among them was Lieutenant Boris Fedorov, a former hunter from Kamchatka, who had tracked wolves across tundra where human scent vanished in minutes. There was Sergeant Oleg Markov, a spotter trained in the Red Army's elite sniper school at Podolsk, and Corporal Ivan Petrov, a signals expert who had survived the siege of Sevastopol by learning to interpret battlefield silence, the gaps between gunfire, the pauses that indicated repositioning, the rhythm of death. They were good, they were experienced, and within 72 hours, half of them would be dead. The operation began at dawn on April 10th. The team moved in staggered formation through the birch forests south of the border, following intelligence reports that placed Yuki's last confirmed kill within a 12-kilometer radius. The plan was methodical. Establish observation posts at elevated positions. Use radio triangulation to detect any unusual electromagnetic signatures, and deploy counter-sniper tactics developed against German sharpshooters. Constant movement, unpredictable patterns, decoy positions. Volkov knew that conventional tactics might not work against an opponent who had already demonstrated an ability to bypass standard defensive measures, but doctrine was all he had. Doctrine and the gnawing suspicion that they were not hunting a sniper so much as walking into a trap someone else had designed. The first death occurred at 14:37 hours on April 11th. Private Alexei Sokolov, positioned as a forward scout approximately 800 meters ahead of the main group, was killed by a single shot to the upper chest. The round entered just below the collarbone and severed the subclavian artery, causing rapid exsanguination. Death was nearly instantaneous. What disturbed Volkov more than the kill itself was the timing. Sokolov had been moving through dense underbrush, his silhouette partially obscured by branches, and the shot had been fired during a moment when he paused to adjust his pack, a pause that lasted less than 3 seconds. The shooter had not just seen him. She had anticipated his movement, predicted the exact moment of vulnerability, and fired into a gap that existed for a fraction of the time a normal human being would need to acquire a target and pull a trigger. Fedorov, the tracker, examined the surrounding terrain and found nothing. No spent casings, no disturbance in the snow, no line of sight that matched the bullet's trajectory. It was as if the round had materialized from the air itself, a phenomenon that violated every principle of ballistics Volkov understood. The team went to ground immediately, establishing a defensive perimeter and ceasing all movement for 6 hours, waiting for a follow-up attack that never came. Yuki, whoever or whatever she was, had taken her shot and vanished, content to let fear do the rest of the work. Over the next 4 days, the psychological toll became as damaging as the kills themselves. The team moved only at night, communicated through hand signals, and established no predictable patterns. Yet, on April 13th, Sergeant Markov was killed while relieving himself behind a tree, shot through the side of the head from a direction the team had assumed was secure. On April 14th, 2 soldiers, Corporal Dmitry Orlov and Private Viktor Antonov, were killed within minutes of each other while attempting to retrieve water from a frozen stream. The shots came from different angles, suggesting either multiple shooters or a single operator who could reposition with inhuman speed. Volkov chose to believe the latter, because the alternative, that there were multiple snipers of this caliber operating in the same territory, was too destabilizing to contemplate. By April 15th, the team had been reduced to 7 men, all of whom were showing signs of severe psychological strain. Fedorov, the tracker, had stopped sleeping. Petrov, the signals expert, had begun muttering about dead zones in the forest, areas where radio signals behaved erratically and sound seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. Volkov himself felt the creeping sensation of being observed, a primal awareness that something was tracking them with the same cold patience they had intended to use against her. The mission had inverted. They were no longer hunters, but prey, moving through a landscape that had been weaponized against them. The breaking point came on April 16th. The team had established a fortified position in a shallow ravine, using fallen trees and snow embankments to create overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook defensive doctrine, the kind of position that should have been nearly impossible to assault without exposure. At 11:23 hours, Lieutenant Fedorov was killed by a shot that entered through the narrow gap between 2 logs. A space less than 8 centimeters wide, at a range later estimated to be over 1,000 meters. The bullet struck him in the throat, and he drowned in his own blood while his comrades watched, unable to help, unable even to identify where the shot had originated. The precision was so extreme, it seemed less like marksmanship and more like surgery performed from a distance, as if Yuki could see through obstacles, through cover, through the very physics of concealment. Volkov made the decision to abort the mission. The remaining 6 men withdrew under cover of smoke grenades and darkness, moving in a chaotic scramble that abandoned all tactical discipline in favor of raw survival. They expected to be picked off during the retreat, but no shots came. Yuki let them go. It was not mercy, it was a message. She had chosen to let them live so they could carry the story back, so that fear could spread further than bullets ever could. The team reached Soviet lines on April 18th. Of the 12 who had entered the forest, 6 returned. The official report filed by Major Volkov cited inconclusive engagement with unidentified hostile forces and recommended no further operations in the sector. Privately, in a letter to his wife that would be found among his possessions after his suicide in 1947, Volkov wrote, "We were not fighting a soldier. We were fighting something that understood us better than we understood ourselves. She knew how we thought, how we moved, how we would react to fear, and she used that knowledge like a scalpel. I do not know if she was human. I know only that she was better at this war than we will ever be." The kill box had been designed for Yuki, but she had turned it inside out, and in doing so, she had taught the Soviet military a lesson they would not forget. There are wars within wars, and in the spaces between official battles, individuals can become forces of nature. The forest kept its secrets, the snow absorbed the blood, and somewhere in the silence Yuki reloaded and waited for the next patrol to believe they were hunting her. In June 1942, a Soviet military engineer named Dr. Leonid Karpov was assigned to a task that existed in no official records: analyze the ballistic evidence from 17 confirmed kills attributed to the sniper known as Yuki, and determine whether the shooter was using conventional weapons or something the Red Army's Technical Intelligence Division had failed to anticipate. Karpov was a specialist in firearms forensics, a man who understood that every bullet told a story about the weapon that fired it, the conditions under which it traveled, and the person who had calculated its trajectory. What he discovered in the forests of the Soviet-Japanese borderlands would challenge everything he thought he understood about the relationship between human skill and mechanical precision. The first anomaly Karpov identified was the consistency of the wounds. In conventional sniper engagements, even highly skilled marksmen produced variations in shot placement due to environmental factors: wind, temperature fluctuations, target movement, physiological stress. But Yuki's kills demonstrated a statistical consistency that bordered on the impossible. Of the 17 bodies Karpov examined, 14 had been killed by shots that struck within a 3-centimeter radius of critical anatomical landmarks: the brainstem, the heart, the subclavian artery. This level of precision suggested either extraordinary talent combined with ideal shooting conditions, or a shooter who had developed methods of environmental compensation that exceeded known Soviet or German techniques. The second anomaly was the ammunition. Recovered bullets were identified as 7.7 mm Arisaka rounds, standard Japanese military issue, but with modifications that puzzled Karpov's team. The projectiles showed signs of hand modification, careful filing and weight adjustment that improved ballistic stability at extreme ranges. More disturbing was the evidence of custom powder loads. The chemical analysis indicated a propellant mixture that burned cooler and cleaner than factory ammunition, reducing muzzle flash and smoke signature to near invisibility. This level of customization required not just technical knowledge, but access to materials and equipment that should not have been available to a field operative operating in isolation. It suggested either a support network the Soviets had failed to detect, or a level of self-sufficiency that redefined what a lone sniper could achieve. The third anomaly was psychological. Karpov interviewed 4 survivors of encounters with Yuki, men who had been part of patrols where others had died, but who had, for reasons they could not explain, been spared. Each described the same phenomenon: the sense of being watched, evaluated, and deliberately bypassed. Private Mikhail Volkov, who had been standing less than 2 meters from Lieutenant Fedorov when Fedorov was killed, described it as being seen through. He felt certain that Yuki had acquired him as a target, had him in her sights, and had chosen not to fire. "She was teaching us," Volkov said during his debriefing. "Every kill was a lesson. She wanted us to know we were alive, because she allowed it." This tactical restraint disturbed Karpov more than the kills themselves. It indicated a level of psychological sophistication uncommon even among elite snipers. Yuki was not simply eliminating targets. She was conducting a form of asymmetric warfare that weaponized fear and uncertainty as effectively as bullets. By killing selectively and unpredictably, she forced Soviet patrols to move slowly, communicate cautiously, and doubt their own security protocols. The operational impact was profound. Entire sectors of the border became no-go zones, not because they were heavily defended, but because soldiers refused to enter terrain where death was precise, invisible, and seemingly random. If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. Karpov's investigation led him to a conclusion that his superiors found unacceptable. Yuki was operating at a level that combined technical mastery, environmental adaptation, and psychological warfare in ways that exceeded the capabilities of known military training programs. His final report, submitted in July 1942, included a recommendation that shocked the NKVD Border Troops Command: do not attempt to hunt her. Instead, cede the contested territories and redirect resources to sectors where conventional tactics remained effective. "We are expending men and materiel to combat a single individual," Karpov wrote, "whose operational impact is disproportionate to her numbers, but entirely rational given her methods. She has turned isolation into an advantage and precision into a force multiplier. We cannot win this engagement using doctrine designed for mass warfare." The recommendation was rejected, but the operational reality shifted nonetheless. By August 1942, Soviet patrols in the border forests had been reduced to minimal presence. Radio communication protocols had been changed to prevent pattern recognition, and officers were instructed to avoid predictable routes and schedules. These were defensive measures, the kind of adaptations armies make when facing superior tactics, and they represented an implicit admission that Yuki had achieved something no individual sniper should have been able to accomplish. She had changed the behavior of an entire military apparatus through the application of precision and fear. Meanwhile, Japanese records from the same period, fragments recovered post-war from archives in Manchuria, paint a different picture. A requisition order dated July 12, 1942, references Asset Yuki and includes a request for specialized optical equipment and cold weather gear, suggesting she was still receiving logistical support despite official denials of her existence. A communication intercept from August 1942, decoded by Soviet intelligence but never acted upon, contains a brief message in Japanese military code. Yuki reports continued operational effectiveness. Recommend extension of independent mission parameters. Supply drop coordinates attached. The message was never confirmed, and the supply drop, if it occurred, was never located. But the implication was clear. Yuki was not acting entirely alone, and her superiors, whoever they were, considered her mission valuable enough to sustain, despite the political risks. By September 1942, the kills had stopped. The last confirmed death attributed to Yuki occurred on September 3rd. A Soviet reconnaissance officer named Captain Pyotr Ivanov shot at dawn while inspecting a border marker. After that, silence. No more bodies, no more sightings, no more intercepted communications. She had either been withdrawn, killed, or simply decided to stop. Soviet intelligence spent 3 months searching for evidence of her fate and found nothing. The Japanese, when questioned after the war, maintained their position. No such operative existed, no such program was authorized, and the woman described in Soviet reports was a fiction born from paranoia and operational failure. Dr. Leonid Karpov's final notation in his personal journal, dated October 15, 1942, reads, "Silence is also a form of communication. She has told us everything we need to know. We were not prepared for what one person could do when freed from the constraints of doctrine and supported by nothing but skill and will. The bullets were just the beginning. The real weapon was the understanding that we were mortal, vulnerable, and predictable. She taught us that, and then she disappeared because the lesson was complete. The mechanics of silence are more complex than the mechanics of killing. They require patience, restraint, and the understanding that what is not done can be as powerful as what is." Yuki understood this. The Red Army did not. The files were sealed, the bodies were buried, and the forest, indifferent to nations and doctrines, absorbed the story into the snow. By October 1942, Akane Fujimoto, if she still thought of herself by that name, had been operating alone in the border forests for 11 months. The physical toll was measurable. Her body weight had dropped to less than 45 kilograms. Her hands showed signs of chronic frostbite, and her eyesight, strained by months of long-range shooting in extreme cold, had begun to deteriorate. But the psychological toll was something no medical examination could quantify. She had killed 31 people. She had lived in isolation so complete that human language had begun to feel foreign, a collection of sounds she remembered but no longer needed. And she had come to understand something that military training had not prepared her for, The rifle she carried, the Type 97 sniper rifle that had become an extension of her body, was not just a tool but a burden that grew heavier with every life it took. In her training, she had been taught to think of killing as a technical problem, a calculation of distance, wind, trajectory, and timing. The instructors had emphasized detachment, the necessity of viewing targets as objects rather than people, as threats to be neutralized rather than individuals with families, histories, and futures. It was a necessary psychological buffer, they said, the only way to function effectively in a role that demanded precision without hesitation. But what they had not taught her, what perhaps no training could teach, was that detachment required constant maintenance, a daily effort to suppress the awareness of what she was doing, and that over time, the effort itself became exhausting. She thought about this on the night of October 12, 1942, as she cleaned her rifle in a makeshift shelter beneath an overturned tree. The weapon required constant care in the cold. Moisture could freeze in the barrel, oil could thicken and cause malfunctions, and the smallest mechanical failure could mean the difference between survival and capture. She worked methodically, her fingers numb despite the wool gloves she wore beneath leather shells. And as she worked, she thought about the faces she remembered. Not all of them. Memory had limits, and 31 was too many to hold clearly, but fragments. The young soldier who had been adjusting his pack when she killed him, the officer who had been writing something in a notebook, the man who had been singing quietly to himself before the bullet silenced him. She had not wanted to remember these details. She had tried in the beginning to follow her training and erase them as quickly as they formed. But the mind has its own rules, and it insists on recording what the will tries to forget. The loneliness was worse than the cold. She had been alone before, on hunting trips in Hokkaido, during training exercises in Manchuria. But those experiences had been temporary, bounded by the knowledge that she would return to human company, to conversation and warmth, and the small rituals that anchored identity. This isolation was different. It was indefinite, unbroken, and absolute. She had not spoken to another person in 5 months. She had not heard her own voice, except for the occasional whispered count during shooting calculations. She had become a function, a process, a thing that moved through the forest and delivered death with mechanical efficiency. And in becoming that thing, she had lost something she did not have a name for, some essential connection to the person she had been before the war, before the training, before the rifle. There were moments when she considered simply walking away. The border was porous, the forests vast, and she knew wilderness survival well enough to disappear completely if she chose. She could abandon the rifle, shed the mission, and become invisible in a different way, not as a sniper but as a refugee, a displaced person lost in the chaos of wartime Asia. But each time the thought formed, it collapsed under the weight of a different question. What would she walk toward? She had no family to return to. Her father had been killed in a training accident in 1941, and her mother had died of pneumonia the year before. She had no home except the military structures that had trained and deployed her, and she had no identity outside the role she had been assigned. To abandon the mission would be to become nothing, a ghost in a different sense, untethered and purposeless. At least here, in the snow, she had function. The rifle gave her meaning, even if the meaning was terrible. She thought about her targets, too, the men she had killed and the reasons she had been ordered to kill them. Soviet intelligence officers, radio operators, scouts. Each one represented a node in a network, a piece of a system that posed a threat to Japanese strategic interests in Manchuria. The logic was sound, she supposed, from a military perspective. But the logic felt thin now, worn down by repetition and proximity to death. She had been taught that war was a contest between nations, ideologies and armies, large abstractions that justified individual violence. But in the forest, abstractions dissolved. There were no nations here, just people trying to survive in a landscape that wanted them dead. And she was part of that landscape now, another element of lethality, no different from the cold or the wolves. On October 20th, 1942, she received her final supply drop. It came at night, a parachute-delivered container that landed 3 kilometers from her current position, marked with coordinates she had been monitoring through encrypted radio bursts. Inside the container, ammunition, medical supplies, dried food, a replacement scope, and a single sealed envelope. She opened it with numb fingers and found a brief message in Japanese. Mission complete. Exfiltration authorized. Proceed to coordinates 43.8762 degree N, 131.9045 degree E by November 1st. Destroy all materials. The message was unsigned, typed on the standard military letterhead, and it represented something she had stopped believing would ever come. An end. She did not feel relief. She felt emptiness, a hollow space where anticipation or joy should have been. For 11 months, she had existed in a state of suspended purpose, sustained by the clarity of her role and the simplicity of her mission. Now that clarity was gone, replaced by the prospect of reintegration into a world she no longer understood. What would she do? What would she become? The questions felt heavier than the rifle, more impossible to answer than any ballistic calculation. She spent the next 5 days moving toward the extraction coordinates, traveling only at night, avoiding Soviet patrols that had increased in frequency as winter approached. She carried the rifle because she had no choice, but she did not fire it again. On October 31st, 1942, she reached the designated location, a clearing near the Ussuri River, where Japanese intelligence had arranged for a covert crossing. The extraction team was there, 2 men in civilian clothing who did not speak to her, did not ask questions, and did not acknowledge what she had done. They simply guided her across the frozen river and into a vehicle that carried her south, away from the forests, away from the snow, away from the war she had fought alone. The rifle was taken from her at the debriefing station in Harbin. A quartermaster logged it as Type 97, field modified, operational, and placed it in storage. She never saw it again. In the months that followed, she was reassigned to administrative duties, given a commendation that could not be publicly acknowledged, and instructed to never discuss her service. She complied, but in the silence that followed, in the years after the war, when she tried to rebuild a life that felt irreparably broken, she would sometimes wake at night and feel the weight of the rifle across her chest, a phantom burden that no debriefing could remove. The war ended. The records were sealed, and Akane Fujimoto, the girl who had become Yuki, the sniper who had killed 31 men and changed the course of military doctrine in a forgotten corner of the war, disappeared into the quiet anonymity of post-war Japan. She died in 1984, alone, in a small apartment in Sapporo, her service unrecognized, her story untold. Among her possessions, investigators found a single photograph, a young woman standing beside a rifle range in Hokkaido, smiling faintly at something outside the frame. The rifle, they say, does not judge, but it remembers. In 1985, 43 years after the last confirmed kill attributed to Yuki, a junior historian named Yuki Tanaka, no relation, though the coincidence would haunt her, was granted limited access to the Soviet military archives in Moscow as part of a bilateral research initiative examining Cold War border tensions. Her area of focus was minor, logistical records and supply chain management along the Soviet-Japanese frontier during the Second World War. She expected to spend 6 weeks cataloging requisition forms and transportation manifests, the bureaucratic detritus that historians sift through in search of patterns. What she found instead was a file that should not have existed, a collection of documents that had been misfiled, mislabeled, and forgotten in the chaos of post-war reorganization. The file was designated Case 47B, Unresolved Personnel Losses, Manchurian Sector, 1942. It contained 17 incident reports, each describing the death of a Soviet soldier or officer under circumstances that defied standard operational explanations. The reports were clinical, bureaucratic, stripped of emotion, but as Tanaka read through them, a pattern emerged. Single-shot kills at extreme range, no witnesses, no tactical logic to the target selection except for the deliberate elimination of communications specialists and intelligence officers. And in the margins of several reports, written in faded ink by different hands, the same notation appeared. Yuki. Tanaka spent 3 days cross-referencing the file with Japanese military archives that had been partially declassified in the 1970s. She found fragments, a personnel file for a woman named Akane Fujimoto, marked classified indefinitely, a supply requisition for specialized sniper equipment routed through an intelligence unit that officially did not exist, a single photograph of a young woman holding a rifle, her expression unreadable, and she found testimony, post-war interviews with former Kwantung Army officers who, in their final years, had begun to speak about programs that had been buried under layers of official denial. One officer, a man named Hiroshi Tanaka who had worked in military intelligence, described a program designed to train operatives for deep reconnaissance behind enemy lines. "We trained 3 women," he said in an interview conducted in 1979, 2 years before his death. "Only one completed the program. We called her Yuki. She was the most effective operator I ever encountered, and the most tragic." Tanaka's research led her to a small apartment in Sapporo, where Akane Fujimoto had died the previous year. The landlord, an elderly man who remembered her as a quiet tenant who paid rent on time and never caused trouble, mentioned that she had been a veteran. "She never talked about the war," he said. "But sometimes, late at night, I would hear her talking to herself. Always the same words. I counted 31. I remember 31. Among Fujimoto's possessions, Tanaka found the photograph, the girl by the rifle range, and a single sheet of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. On it, written in careful script, was a list of names, 31 names, Soviet names. The men she had killed. The discovery forced Tanaka to confront a question that transcended historical research. What obligation do we owe to those who fought wars that were never acknowledged, who killed and died in silence, whose suffering was erased because their existence was inconvenient? The Soviet Union had denied that Yuki existed because to admit her effectiveness would have been to admit vulnerability. Japan had denied her existence because women in combat roles contradicted the narrative of military honor and masculine duty, and Akane Fujimoto herself had remained silent because the alternative, speaking about what she had done, would have forced her to relive experiences that had already consumed her life. Tanaka wrote a paper. It was published in an obscure academic journal in 1987, under the title Phantom Operatives, Unacknowledged Female Combatants in the Soviet-Japanese Border Conflicts, 1941-1942. The paper was rigorous, carefully sourced, and it presented Akane Fujimoto's story not as heroism or tragedy, but as historical fact, a data point in the larger architecture of wartime violence. The paper was ignored. No major publications picked it up. No historians challenged or confirmed its findings. It existed, as Akane Fujimoto had existed, in the margins of acknowledged history, but stories, like bullets, travel further than their authors intend. In 1993, a retired Soviet officer named Viktor Sokolov, son of the intelligence officer who had first documented Yuki's kills, read Tanaka's paper and recognized the names in Akane's list. They matched the men his father had investigated, the deaths that had haunted his father until his suicide in 1947. Sokolov wrote to Tanaka, enclosing his father's personal journal, the one that contained the final entry about Yuki and the admission that the Soviet military had been outmatched by a single individual. The journal confirmed what Tanaka had suspected, that the fear and respect Yuki had generated was not propaganda, but operational reality, that she had fundamentally changed how the Red Army approached border security, and that her silence after the war was not weakness, but the final expression of a will that had been bent but never broken. In 2003, the Japanese government quietly acknowledged the existence of experimental intelligence programs during the Second World War, including programs that had recruited women for roles traditionally reserved for men. The acknowledgement was buried in a footnote of a larger historical report, and it mentioned no names. But for Yuki Tanaka, it was enough. It meant that Akane Fujimoto's service, however terrible, however lonely, was no longer entirely invisible. Tanaka visited Fujimoto's grave in Sapporo in 2004. It was a small plot, marked with a simple stone that gave only her name and dates of birth and death. There was no mention of service, no acknowledgement of what she had endured. Tanaka placed a single flower, a white chrysanthemum, the flower of mourning, and stood in silence for a long time, thinking about the rifle that had weighed so much, about the 31 names that had been carried until the end, and about the price of being effective in a war that refused to see you. The archives remember what the living forget. The snow has melted, but the records remain, fragmented and incomplete, waiting for someone to read between the lines and see the shape of a woman who became a weapon, who fought a war in silence, and who died without ever being thanked or condemned for what she had done. History is not just what happened, it is also what was hidden, what was denied, and what was carried alone until the weight became unbearable. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Akane Fujimoto. See you in the next video. The war ended, but the echo of the rifle, fired across frozen distances in a war that no one acknowledged, still reverberates through the archives, waiting to be heard.